It was a bright, sunny Tuesday afternoon in Maple Grove. This was a small, quiet neighborhood where everyone knew each other, or at least, that's what they thought. The houses were neat, the grass was green, and kids played outside until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of place where nothing big ever happened. Well, not until now. Let me tell you about Jake Riley. Jake was a regular guy. He wasn't super tall or super strong. He didn't have a fancy car or a big house. He was just a normal dude who liked normal stuff like eating pizza, playing catch, and hanging out with his best buddy, Max. Max wasn't a person, though. Max was a dog. A scruffy, floppy-eared mutt with a wagging tail and a big, goofy smile. Jake loved Max more than anything. They were a team. Every morning, Jake would grab Max's leash, and they'd go for a walk around the block. Every night, Max would curl up next to Jake on the couch while they watched TV. They were happy. But someone wasn't happy about Jake and Max. Someone was watching them a little too closely. That someone was Karen Withers. Now, Karen wasn't just any neighbor. Oh no. She was the Karen. You know what I mean, right? The kind of person who's always sticking her nose where it doesn't belong. The kind who yells if your trash can isn't lined up perfectly or if your grass grows 1 inch too tall. Karen was the boss of the Ho, that's the group that makes rules for the neighborhood. She acted like she was the queen of Maple Grove. She'd walk around with her clipboard, writing down every little thing she didn't like. Your mailbox is crooked, she'd shout. Your bike is in the driveway too long. People didn't like her much, but they didn't say anything. They just rolled their eyes and went back to their lives. Jake didn't pay much attention to Karen at first. He was too busy living his simple, happy life with Max. He'd wave at her sometimes when he saw her glaring over the fence, but that was it. He didn't know she was trouble. Big trouble. See, Karen didn't like Max. She didn't like how he barked at birds or how he dug little holes in Jake's yard. She'd squint her eyes at him and mutter things under her breath. That dog's a problem, she'd say to herself. Someone needs to do something about it. Jake had no clue what was coming. He didn't know Karen was about to mess with him and his best friend in a way he'd never expect. It all started so quietly that nobody saw it sneaking up. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and Maple Grove looked like the perfect little place. But looks can trick you. Sometimes, the calmest days hide the wildest storms. Let's rewind a bit. Jake had lived in Maple Grove for about a year. He moved there because it was peaceful and cheap. He got a small house with a tiny yard just big enough for Max to run around in. Jake wasn't the kind of guy who cared about fancy stuff. He worked at a store downtown, selling tools and paint. It wasn't a big job, but it paid the bills. All he really wanted was a quiet life with his dog. Max was his family. Jake found him at a shelter 2 years ago. Max was skinny and scared back then, with matted fur and sad eyes. Jake took him home, fed him, and gave him a bath. From that day on, they were stuck together like glue. Max wasn't perfect, though. He'd chew on Jake's socks sometimes or bark at squirrels out the window. But Jake didn't mind. That's just how dogs are, right? They're messy and loud and full of love. Max made Jake laugh every day. Like when he'd chase his own tail until he fell over, or when he'd steal a slice of pizza right off Jake's plate. Jake would pretend to be mad, but he couldn't stay upset at that goofy face. Karen didn't see Max that way. To her, Max wasn't cute or funny. He was a pest. A loud, furry pest who didn't follow her rules. She'd stand by her perfect roses, holding her garden hose, and stare at Jake's house. She'd watch Max sniff the grass or roll around in the dirt. Her nose would wrinkle up like she smelled something bad. Dogs like that don't belong here, she'd grumble. She never said it to Jake's face, not yet, but she thought it all the time. The neighborhood knew Karen was bossy. She'd knock on doors and tell people to fix things. Your fence is the wrong color, she'd yell. Or, you can't park there. Most folks just nodded and waited for her to leave. They didn't want the fight. But Jake? He didn't bow down to her. He'd smile and say, "Okay, Karen," then go right back to what he was doing. That drove her nuts. She wasn't used to people ignoring her. Here's the thing, Karen didn't just talk. She made plans. Sneaky plans. She didn't like losing, and she didn't like Max. She started thinking about how to fix things her way. Jake didn't know it, but she was watching him every day. She'd peek out her window when he left for work. She'd count how long Max stayed outside. She was waiting for the right moment. That Tuesday afternoon felt like any other. Jake woke up, made some toast, and let Max out to play. The sky was blue, and a warm breeze rustled the trees. Kids rode their bikes down the street, laughing and shouting. Jake stood on his porch, sipping coffee, watching Max chase a butterfly. "Good boy," he called out, smiling. Max barked back, his tail wagging like crazy. Everything was perfect. But across the street, Karen was watching. She stood by her mailbox, pretending to check her flowers. Her eyes were locked on Max. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just stared. Jake didn't see her. He didn't notice the way her hands tightened around her clipboard. He didn't hear her whisper, "Not for long, Mutt." That's where our story starts to get wild. Jake thought he had a normal neighbor. He thought Max was safe. He thought Maple Grove was just a boring little place. But he was wrong. Karen wasn't just nosy. She was trouble. And she was about to mess with the wrong guy and the wrong dog. Karen Withers didn't like Jake Riley one bit. From the very first day he moved into Maple Grove, she had it out for him. Maybe it was because Max, Jake's scruffy little dog, barked at her fancy rose bushes one time. Those roses were her pride and joy. She watered them every day and talked to them like they were her babies. Or maybe it was because Jake didn't follow her hoa rules like everyone else did. The hoa was Karen's kingdom, and she liked people to listen to her. But Jake? He didn't care about her silly rules. He'd just do his own thing, and that made Karen mad. Really mad. Karen wasn't quiet about it either. She'd stand by the fence between their yards, her arms crossed, her eyes squinting like she was trying to see through Jake. "That Mutt of yours is a menace," she'd snap. Her voice was sharp, like a teacher scolding a kid for running in the hall. She'd point her skinny, bony finger right at Max, who'd usually be sniffing the grass or chasing his tail. "One day, he's gonna learn some manners or else," she'd say. That "or else" part sounded spooky, like a warning in a scary movie. Jake didn't take her seriously, though. He'd just smile, give her a little wave, and say, "Sure, Karen." Then he'd go back to playing with Max or fixing something in his yard. He thought she was all talk, like a grumpy old lady who just liked to complain. Max would wag his tail and bark, happy as ever, and Jake would laugh. To him, Karen was just a loud neighbor who didn't matter much. He didn't see the storm coming. But Karen wasn't joking. Not even a little. When she looked at Max, she didn't see a cute dog with floppy ears and a big smile. She saw a troublemaker. A criminal. She'd glare at him like he'd just robbed a bank. Her lips would move, and she'd mutter things under her breath, things Jake couldn't hear. "Gotta fix this problem," she'd whisper to herself. "That dog's gotta go." Her eyes would narrow, and her hands would curl into fists. She wasn't just annoyed. She was planning something. Something sneaky. Jake didn't know it yet, but Karen wasn't the kind of person who let things slide. She liked being in charge. She liked winning. And she didn't like losing to a guy like Jake or his silly dog. See, most people in Maple Grove just nodded when Karen bossed them around. They'd say, "Yes, Karen," and fix whatever she complained about. But Jake didn't play that game. When she told him to keep Max quiet, he'd say, "He's a dog, Karen. Dogs bark." When she told him to move his trash can, he'd shrug and leave it where it was. That drove her up the wall. It wasn't just Max she hated. It was Jake, too. She didn't like how he didn't bow down to her. She'd spent years making sure everyone in the neighborhood knew she was the boss. She'd march around with her clipboard, telling people what to do. "Cut your grass," she'd yell. "Paint your fence." Everyone listened except Jake. And that made her feel small. Karen didn't like feeling small. She liked feeling big and important. So, she decided Jake and Max had to pay. The tension started building slow, like a pot of water heating up on the stove. At first, it was just little things. Karen would stare at Jake's house longer than usual. She'd stand by her window, peeking through the curtains, watching Max run around the yard. She'd frown and shake her head. Sometimes, she'd walk over to the fence and just stand there, staring. Max would see her and bark, and she'd hiss, "Quiet, you little monster." Jake would hear it and chuckle, thinking she was funny. But she wasn't trying to be funny. She was dead serious. One day, things got worse. Jake was outside tossing a ball for Max to chase. It was a perfect afternoon, the sun was shining, and a cool breeze was blowing. Max was having the time of his life, leaping up to catch the ball in his mouth. Jake was grinning, proud of his goofy pup. But then Karen showed up. She marched right over to the fence, her face red and her eyes blazing. "That dog is too loud," she shouted. "He's ruining my peace and quiet. You better do something about him, Jake, or I will." Jake stopped tossing the ball and looked at her. Max ran over, wagging his tail, thinking it was playtime. "He's just a dog, Karen," Jake said, keeping his voice calm. "He's not hurting anybody." But Karen didn't care. She leaned over the fence, pointing that bony finger again. "He's a menace. A noisy, dirty menace. You think you can just move in here and ignore the rules? Think again." Then she turned and stomped back to her house, slamming her door so hard the windows shook. Jake scratched his head, confused. "What's her problem?" he muttered to Max. Max barked, like he was saying, "I don't know, but she's weird." Jake laughed and went back to playing. He didn't think much of it. He figured Karen was just having a bad day. But he was wrong. That wasn't just a bad day. That was the start of her war against him and Max. Karen didn't let it go. Every day after that, she got grumpier. She'd watch Jake and Max like a hawk. If Max barked at a squirrel, she'd yell over the fence. If Jake left his trash can out too long, she'd bang on his door and complain. She'd write little notes on her clipboard, smirking to herself. Jake started to notice, but he still didn't worry. "She's just crazy," he'd tell Max, ruffling his fur. "Nothing to be scared of." Oh, but there was something to be scared of. Karen wasn't just crazy. She was sneaky. She had a plan brewing in her head, a plan Jake couldn't see coming. She'd sit in her kitchen, sipping tea, staring out the window at Jake's house. "Not for long," she'd whisper. "Not for long." Her voice was quiet, but her mind was loud. She was thinking hard. She was plotting. And poor Jake had no idea his world was about to flip upside down. See, Karen wasn't happy just yelling. She wanted to win. She wanted Jake to feel sorry, and she wanted Max gone. She didn't care if Max was Jake's best friend. She didn't care if Jake was happy. All she cared about was being the boss. And she was ready to do something big, something mean to make that happen. The tension was growing, like a rubber band stretching tighter and tighter. Soon, it was going to snap. Jake kept living his life, clueless. He'd walk Max around the block, wave at neighbors, and enjoy his days. But Karen? She was waiting. She was watching. And she was ready to strike. One morning, Jake woke up to the worst day ever. He rolled out of bed, rubbed his eyes, and went to let Max out like he always did. But when he opened the back door, something was wrong. Max wasn't there. His little dog bed was empty. The yard was quiet. Jake's heart started beating fast. He stepped outside and looked around. The gate, the one that kept Max safe, was wide open. Max's leash, which always hung by the door, was gone too. And there wasn't a single paw print in the dirt. It was like Max had vanished into thin air. Jake's stomach dropped. It felt like a big rock was sitting in his belly. "Max," he shouted, running around the yard. "Max, where are you, buddy?" He checked under the porch. He looked behind the bushes. He even peeked in the trash can, just in case. Nothing. No bark, no wag, no Max. Jake's hands started to shake. Max was his best friend. He couldn't be gone. Then, something caught his eye across the street. There was Karen. She was standing by her perfect roses, holding her watering can. Water dripped onto the petals, but she wasn't looking at the flowers. She was looking at Jake. And she was smiling a smug little grin that made her look like she knew something he didn't. "Lost something," she called out. Her voice was all sweet and fake, like a kid pretending to be nice when they're really up to no good. Jake froze. That grin. That voice. It hit him like a lightning bolt. Did Karen know something? His blood started to boil. He felt hot and mad, like he wanted to yell. But he kept cool. He took a deep breath and walked to the edge of his yard. Karen, he said, trying to sound calm, did you see Max this morning? Karen didn't even blink. She shrugged her shoulders, still smirking. Dogs run off all the time, she said. Maybe you should have kept a better eye on him. Her words sounded mean, even though she said them with that fake sweet tone. She turned back to her roses, acting like nothing was wrong. But Jake wasn't dumb. He saw that smirk. He heard the way she talked. Something was fishy. That's when he noticed it's something weird. Karen's garage door was open, just a tiny bit. It wasn't wide open, but it was cracked enough to see a sliver of darkness inside. Jake squinted. He stood still, listening hard. And then he heard a tiny sound. A little whimper. It was so soft he almost missed it, but it was there. A whimper that sounded just like Max when he wanted a treat. Jake's heart jumped. Was Max in there? Jake didn't say anything yet. He didn't run over and bang on the door. He just stood there, thinking. His eyes went from Karen to the garage, then back to Karen. She didn't look at him. She kept watering her roses, humming a little tune like everything was fine. But Jake's mind was racing. Could Karen have taken Max? Would she really do something that mean? Here's the thing, Karen didn't know something big. Max wasn't just any dog. He was special. Not because he could do tricks or because he was super smart, though Jake thought he was pretty clever. No, Max was special because Jake had put a tiny gadget on his collar, a GPS tracker. It was a little black box, no bigger than a quarter, that Jake clipped on after a scare last summer. Max had wandered off once, chasing a rabbit, and Jake couldn't find him for hours. It was awful. So Jake got the tracker. It hooked up to an app on his phone, and it told him exactly where Max was, all the time. Karen didn't know about that tracker. She thought Max was just a regular, noisy dog she could get rid of. She thought she was so sneaky, so smart. But that little gadget? It was about to ruin her whole day. Jake didn't know everything yet, but he was starting to figure it out. The pieces were coming together, slow but sure. He walked back inside, his brain buzzing. He grabbed his phone off the kitchen table and opened the GPS app. His fingers were shaky as he tapped the screen. Come on, he muttered. The app loaded, and a map popped up. Jake held his breath. Then bam! A little red dot blinked on the screen. It wasn't far away. It wasn't down the street or in the woods. It was right across the road. Right at Karen's house. Jake's eyes got wide. No way, he whispered. He stared at the dot, then out the window at Karen. She was still by her roses, acting all innocent. But that dot didn't lie. Max was in her house, or at least, his collar was. Jake's hands clenched into fists. He wasn't just mad now. He was sure. Karen had taken Max. She'd opened his gate, grabbed his leash, and stolen his dog. But why? Why would she do that? Jake started thinking back. All those times she yelled about Max being loud. All those glares over the fence. That day she said, one day, he's gonna learn some manners or else. It wasn't just talk. She meant it. She'd been waiting for a chance to get rid of Max. And now, she'd done it. Or so she thought. Jake put his phone in his pocket and stepped outside again. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He just watched Karen. She didn't see him staring. She was too busy pretending nothing was wrong. But Jake was onto her now. That whimper from the garage. That smirk on her face. That dot on his phone. It all added up. The air felt thick, like before a big storm. Jake's heart was pounding. He wanted to march over and demand Max back right then. But he waited. He needed to be smart. Karen thought she'd won. She thought Jake was clueless. She didn't know he had proof. She didn't know he was one step ahead. Max was out there, somewhere in Karen's house. Maybe tied up. Maybe scared. Jake hated thinking about it. Max was his buddy, his little shadow. And Karen had taken him. But Jake wasn't going to let her get away with it. He had that tracker. He had a plan starting to form in his head. The game was changing, and Karen didn't even know it yet. The morning sun climbed higher, but the day didn't feel bright anymore. It felt heavy. Something big was coming. Jake could feel it. Karen could smirk all she wanted, but her sneaky little trick was about to blow up in her face. Jake didn't wait around. He wasn't going to let Karen get away with this. His best friend Max was missing, and he was pretty sure she had something to do with it. He grabbed his phone from his pocket so fast he almost dropped it. His hands were shaking not just from being mad, but from being excited too. He opened the GPS app, the one that tracked Max's collar. He tapped the screen, waiting for it to load. And then bam! There it was. A little red dot blinking bright and clear. It wasn't down the street. It wasn't in the park. It was right inside Karen's house, across the road. Jake's eyes got big. He stared at the dot, then looked out his window at Karen's place. She was still outside, watering her roses, acting like nothing was wrong. But Jake knew better now. His hands shook harder, but a grin spread across his face. "Oh, you messed up big time, Karen," he muttered under his breath. He wasn't scared anymore. He was ready. Karen thought she was so sneaky, but she didn't know about the tracker. She didn't know Jake had her number. He shoved his phone in his pocket and marched out the door. His sneakers hit the ground hard as he crossed the street. His heart was pounding like a drum, boom, boom, boom. He wasn't going to let Karen wiggle out of this. Not today. When he got to her front door, he didn't knock soft like a polite neighbor. No way. He banged on it loud, bang, bang, bang. It was so loud it sounded like thunder, loud enough to wake up anyone in the whole neighborhood. "Karen, open the door. Now," he said. His voice was strong, not wobbly at all. The door creaked open, just a little. Karen peeked out, her face all scrunched up like she'd just bitten a sour lemon. "What's your problem?" she snapped, sounding all huffy and annoyed. She crossed her arms and stood in the doorway, like she was trying to block him. But Jake wasn't here to play games. Before she could say another word, he yanked his phone out and held it up right in her face. The screen glowed with that blinking red dot, right smack in the middle of her house. "Max's GPS says he's in there," Jake said, his voice steady. "Wanna explain that?" Karen's face changed fast. It went from red and mad to white as a ghost. Her eyes got wide, and her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out at first. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Her voice was shaky now, not bossy like usual. She took a step back, clutching the door. But Jake could tell she was lying. That stammer, that scared look, she wasn't fooling him. He wasn't buying her act for a second. Jake didn't wait for her to invite him in. He pushed past her, not mean or rough, but firm and polite. "Excuse me," he said, stepping inside. Karen squeaked, "Hey, you can't just..." But Jake didn't stop. He had the GPS app open, and he followed that little red dot like a treasure map. It led him through her living room, past her fancy couch and her big TV. Karen trailed behind him, yelling, "Get out of my house." But Jake kept going. He wasn't leaving without Max. The dot took him to a door in the hallway. It was the basement door. Jake's heart jumped. He grabbed the handle and pulled it open. A dark staircase stretched down into the shadows. He flicked on the light and started down the steps, one at a time. "Max," he called softly. Karen was still upstairs, shouting, "You have no right." But then Jake heard it, a sound that made his whole body light up. A little bark. A happy, familiar bark. He ran down the last few steps and turned the corner. And there he was, Max. His scruffy little dog was tied up with a rope in the corner of Karen's basement. His leash was knotted around a pipe, and his collar was still on, blinking with that tiny GPS tracker. Max's tail wagged like crazy when he saw Jake. He barked again, bouncing on his paws, his big eyes shining. Jake dropped to his knees and hugged him tight. "Buddy. You're okay," he said, laughing. Max licked his face, happy as ever. Jake looked at that rope, then at Max's collar. The tracker was still there, glowing faintly. Karen hadn't noticed it. She'd stolen Max, tied him up down here, thinking she'd teach Jake a lesson. She wanted to scare him, maybe make him move away. She thought she was so smart, getting rid of the noisy mutt once and for all. Too bad she didn't check the collar. That little gadget had ruined her whole plan. Jake untied the rope with quick fingers. "Come on, Max," he said, standing up. Max jumped around him, barking and wagging his tail. Jake turned to head back upstairs, but Karen was there now, standing at the top of the steps. Her face was still white, but her eyes were angry again. You can't prove anything," she yelled. "That dog could have wandered in here." Jake held up his phone again. "Really, Karen? His GPS says he's been here since this morning. You gonna tell me he tied himself up too?" Karen's mouth flapped open and shut, like a fish out of water. She didn't have an answer. She'd been caught, and she knew it. Jake walked up the stairs, Max right beside him. Karen stepped back, her hands shaking. I just wanted peace," she said, her voice high and whiny. "That dog's always barking." Jake stopped and looked at her. "You don't get to steal my dog because you don't like him," he said. His voice was calm but strong. "Max isn't your problem to fix." Karen didn't say anything back. She just stood there, looking small and silly. All her bossy power was gone. Jake had the proof, and Max was safe. The big reveal had hit her like a truck. She'd messed with the wrong guy and the wrong dog. That tracker was her undoing, and she didn't see it coming. Jake patted Max's head and smiled. "Let's go home, buddy," he said. They walked past Karen, out the door, and into the sunlight. She didn't follow. She didn't yell. She just stood there, caught in her own trap. The game was over, and Jake had won. Jake couldn't stop smiling as he knelt down in Karen's basement. Max was right there, his tail wagging like a little windmill. The rope around his leash was tight, but Jake's fingers worked fast. He untied it, pulling the knots loose until Max was free. "There you go, buddy," Jake said, his voice soft and happy. Max jumped up, barking and licking Jake's face. Jake laughed and scooped him up in his arms. Max was heavy, but Jake didn't care. His best friend was safe, and that's all that mattered. He stood up, holding Max close, and turned to face Karen. She was still at the top of the basement stairs, looking down at him. Her face was all twisted up, part mad, part scared. Jake didn't yell or point fingers. He just looked at her, his eyes steady, and said, "You're done." His voice was calm but firm, like a teacher telling a kid recess is over. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She knew she'd lost. By then, the noise had gotten loud. Karen's yelling, Jake's banging on the door, Max's barking. It woke up half the neighborhood. People started stepping outside their houses, rubbing sleepy eyes and whispering to each other. "What's going on?" someone asked. "Is that Jake at Karen's place?" another said. They gathered on their lawns and porches, watching as Jake walked out of Karen's house with Max in his arms. Jake didn't keep it a secret. He held up his phone, the GPS app still glowing with that little red dot. "She took Max," he called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She tied him up in her basement, but his tracker showed me right where he was." The neighbors gasped. Some shook their heads. Others started talking all at once. "Karen did that. No way. I knew she was mean, but this." Karen stumbled out behind Jake, her hands flapping like she wanted to stop the chatter. "It's not true," she shouted. "He's lying." But Jake just turned his phone so everyone could see. The dot blinked, clear as day, right on her house. The crowd got quiet for a second, then started murmuring again. Karen's smug little grin was gone. Her bossy, scary reign over Maple Grove was falling apart right there in front of everyone. One lady, Mrs. Carter from down the street, pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the cops," she said, her voice sharp. "This isn't okay." Karen's eyes got big. "No, wait," she squeaked, but Mrs. Carter was already dialing. The neighbors nodded, agreeing with her. They'd had enough of Karen's tricks. Jake stood there, petting Max, watching it all happen. He didn't have to say much. The proof was in his hand, and the neighborhood was on his side now. It didn't take long, maybe an hour, before a police car rolled up. The lights flashed red and blue, and a tall officer stepped out. He had a serious face, like he didn't mess around. Jake walked over and showed him the phone. "She took my dog," Jake said, pointing at Karen. "The GPS proves it. He was in her basement." The officer looked at the screen, then at Max, who barked happily in Jake's arms. He scribbled something on a notepad and turned to Karen. "Ma'am, let's talk," he said. Karen tried to explain. "I didn't mean he's so loud," she stammered, her voice all high and whiny. But the officer didn't look impressed. He raised an eyebrow and kept writing. "Stealing a dog isn't okay," he said. "We'll figure this out." Karen's shoulders slumped. She looked small now, not big and bossy like before. The neighbors watched, whispering to each other. Justice was coming, and they could feel it. Here's the thing: Karen hadn't just messed with Jake. She'd been pulling sneaky stunts for years. Turns out, she'd taken stuff from other people too. A kid's bike went missing once, and everyone thought it got lost. Someone's garden tools disappeared, and they blamed the wind. Karen always acted innocent, and no one could prove anything. She'd boss people around, scare them into following her rules, and get away with it. But not this time. Jake's GPS tracker was the proof they'd all been waiting for. The news spread fast. By that afternoon, the HOA had a meeting. It wasn't even a real meeting, just a bunch of neighbors standing around in Mrs. Carter's yard, talking loud. "She's gotta go," Mr. Lopez said. He lived next to Karen and was tired of her yelling about his loud music. "She can't run the HOA after this," Mrs. Carter added. They all agreed. Karen wasn't the queen of Maple Grove anymore. They voted right there, with Jake and Max watching from the side. Karen was out. Booted. Done. Jake didn't say much during all this. He didn't need to. He just stood there, holding Max, letting the neighborhood figure it out. But then something cool happened. People started coming up to him. Mr. Lopez patted his shoulder. "Sorry I didn't believe you about her," he said. Mrs. Carter smiled and said, "You're a good guy, Jake. And Max is a good dog." Even little Timmy from 2 houses down ran over and hugged Max. "I'm glad you're back," he said. One by one, neighbors who'd ignored Jake before, who'd maybe even thought he was the troublemaker, came to say sorry. "We should have stood up to her sooner," one lady said. "You're okay in my book," an old man added, tipping his hat. Jake just nodded and smiled. "Thanks," he said. "Max and I are just happy to be home." Max barked, like he was agreeing. His tail wagged so hard it looked like it might fall off. By the time the sun started setting, the street was calm again. The police car was gone, and Karen was inside her house, probably packing up her clipboard and her mean ideas. The neighbors went back to their yards, but they weren't scared of her anymore. They waved at Jake as he walked Max home. "See you tomorrow," someone called. "Good job, Jake," another said. Jake opened his door and let Max inside. The little dog ran straight to his water bowl, slurping loud. Jake flopped onto the couch and laughed. "We did it, Max," he said. Max jumped up next to him, curling up like nothing had ever happened. But something had changed. Karen's big, bossy days were over. The neighborhood was free. And Jake? He'd shown everyone that he wasn't just some regular guy. He was a guy who'd fight for his dog and win. Max barked again, short and happy, like he knew they'd come out on top. Jake scratched his ears. "Yeah, buddy," he said. "We won." Justice was served, and it felt good. The sun was going down over Maple Grove that night. The sky turned orange and pink, painting the little neighborhood in soft, warm colors. Jake sat on his couch, his legs stretched out, feeling tired but happy. Max was curled up right next to him, his scruffy head resting on Jake's lap. Jake reached down and scratched Max's ears, just the way he liked it. Max let out a little huff, like he was saying, "Thanks, buddy." Jake smiled big. After everything that happened, they were safe. They were home. And they'd won. Jake looked out the window at Karen's house across the street. The lights were on, but it was quiet over there now. No more yelling. No more bossy clipboard. Karen had thought she was the biggest, toughest person around. She thought she could control everyone, tell them what to do, scare them into listening. She thought taking Max would show Jake who was in charge. But she was wrong. Sometimes, the smallest things can bring down the biggest bullies. Like that tiny GPS tracker on Max's collar. It was just a little gadget, smaller than a cookie, but it changed everything. It showed the truth. It stopped Karen in her tracks. Jake leaned back, thinking about it all. Karen didn't see him and Max coming. She thought Jake was just some regular guy who'd give up easy. She thought Max was just a noisy dog she could get rid of. But they were a team, a strong team. Jake didn't give up when Max went missing. He didn't let Karen scare him. He used his head, checked that tracker, and fought to get his buddy back. And Max? He stayed brave, even tied up in that dark basement. Together, they showed Karen she couldn't push them around. That made Jake feel good inside. It wasn't just about winning. It was about standing up for what's right. Max was his family, and nobody messes with family. Jake looked down at Max, who was snoring softly now. "You're the best, you know that," he whispered. Max's tail thumped once, like he heard, even in his sleep. Jake chuckled. Life was back to normal, or maybe even better than normal. "Hey, here's a question for you, what would you do if someone messed with your best buddy? Tell me in the comments below. I wanna know. Think about it. Maybe it's your dog, or your best friend, or even your little brother or sister. What would you do to keep them safe? Would you be brave like Jake? Would you find a smart way to fix it? I bet you've got some cool ideas. Life's funny like that, isn't it? People who act all high and mighty like they're better than everyone else, they're usually the ones who fall the hardest." Karen thought she was untouchable. She thought she could do whatever she wanted, and nobody would stop her. But she didn't count on Jake. She didn't count on Max. She didn't count on that little tracker shining a big light on her sneaky tricks. When she fell fast. And now the neighborhood was free from her mean ways. That's a big lesson right there. You don't have to be the loudest or the strongest to win. You just have to be smart and keep going, even when things get tough. Jake wasn't a superhero. He didn't have muscles like a wrestler or a fancy car like a movie star. He was just a regular guy with a goofy dog. But he cared. He paid attention. And he didn't let a bully win. That's what made him special. That's what made him strong. Maybe you're like Jake too. Maybe you've got something or someone you'd fight for. It doesn't have to be big. It could be your favorite toy, or your pet goldfish, or the treehouse you built with your friends. Whatever it is, hold on to it. Keep it close. Because the stuff that matters most, that's worth standing up for. Jake looked out at the stars popping up in the sky. The day had been wild, scary, then mad, then happy. But now it was peaceful. Max snored louder, and Jake laughed again. "We're okay, buddy," he said. "We're okay." He felt proud. Not the loud, braggy kind of proud, but the quiet kind that sits warm in your chest. He'd protected Max. He'd shown Karen she couldn't push people around. And he'd made Maple Grove a little better for everyone. So here's the thing to remember: stay smart. Stay kind. And keep an eye on what matters most. Bullies like Karen might pop up sometimes, acting big and tough. But they don't always win. Not when you've got a good heart and a good plan. Jake and Max proved that. They took a tiny tool, a tracker, and turned it into a big victory. You can do that too, in your own way. Maybe not with a tracker, but with something else, something that's all yours. The night got darker, and the crickets started chirping outside. Jake pulled a blanket over him and Max. "Good night, buddy," he said, closing his eyes. Tomorrow was a new day. Maybe it'd be quiet. Maybe it'd be crazy. But whatever happened, Jake knew he'd be ready. He had Max, and Max had him. That was enough.